Fantastic. I think we can get started. So welcome everyone. I am Luigi Butera, and I'm very pleased to host our third installment of our SPY seminar series. We're doing this in lieu of the regular conference, which will be back next year. So in today's episode, we will talk about the role that social image, reputation, and social norms play in charitable giving and fundraising activities. We are sure that this is a very interesting topic for all practitioners out there. We know that fundraisers routinely advertise donors' contribution. They routinely leverage existing donors to access new donors. There's a tendency to try to appeal to social norms to promote giving and publicly diffuse information about impact. These are all practices that are very, very common in the charitable giving space. So what we'll do today is discuss how economic science is exploring these important issues, how economists think about these problems. And to do that, with me today, there are two superstar economists that have made fantastic contribution in this area. We're going to learn through about 45 minutes. We're going to learn about their fantastic work. So today we have Ragan Petrie and Christine Exley. Ragan is a professor of economics at Texas A&M and a fellow at the University of Melbourne in Australia. Ragan, fantastic to have you here. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And we have Christina, who is the Marvin Bauer Associate Professor at Harvard Business School. Christina, thank you for joining us.
Great to be here.
Super. So before we start, I sincerely encourage everyone in the audience out there to use the Q&A to ask questions. Of course, we have a lot of things to talk about, and we're all very excited about research, but of course, we want to hear from you, especially practitioners. Please feel free to chime in and ask questions through the Q&A. We'll be really happy to interact with you. So I would like to first start with a question to Ragan. Ragan, we know that public visibility has a dramatic effect on how people behave when it comes to prosocial behavior. And you have done a lot of work in this area, a lot of seminal work investigating how anonymity and public visibility affects people's decision to contribute to public goods. What are sort of the main takeaways of your research, and what are some of the implications that you think are maybe useful for practitioners out there?
Sure. So thanks again for having me. So we know that very few people give anonymously. It seems to have having this option to be recognized can increase contribution. So some of my early work with Jim Andreoni was looking at the effect of people being their contributions being non-confidential. So there was visibility in terms of who actually gave a donation and the amounts. And what we found was this had a very strong effect on people's willingness to give. So they gave a lot more when they were not anonymous, or their contributions were not confidential. And there's been work in other areas as well that shows that this visibility really enhances pro-social behavior. Now, it's not always the case that visibility or public recognition can be positive. So Luigi actually has some nice work that suggests that it's not always welfare enhancing. And I hope Christina is going to talk a bit about her work as well, that suggests that this idea of public recognition can be kind of a governor on pro-social behavior, but it's not always working in a positive direction. The other thing that we found in this early work was that this recognition, especially in terms of donation amounts and reporting, can be very important. So how it is actually done can be really important. We did some experiments around reporting in categories. So this idea that charities have where they report donations like $100 to $200 or something like that, where you choose the categories can be super important, because people end up donating on the tail end of the categories because they get this recognition from this, but so it depends a lot. So it's very important where these things have been placed. And there's been interesting work by other researchers looking at this idea of where those things get placed. Some other things that, so kind of takeaways for practitioners can be things like, you know, give people the opportunity to be recognized. Not everyone wants to be, but our research, the research that I've done with Jim, suggests that just having that option is really important, and people take it up. And we do observe that as well. There are anonymous donors, but there are a lot of people who'd like to be recognized for their pro-social acts and their donations. So giving people that opportunity, I think, is really important. And they can take it up if they want to, and if they don't, they can remain anonymous. So having that option, I think, is really important.
Yeah, fantastic. It's and it's really tricky in terms of you mentioned sort of one paper we did. We were very surprised where we were looking at the value that people place on being visible. Exactly like in your research, we find that the people really want to be seen, but we were very surprised to find that even for, in our context, really small acts that lead to small donations, there was a substantial amount of shame. So people really like social recognition. At the same time, it seems like people tend to compare themselves a lot with others, and when they feel that their performance is way below others, you have the opposite effect. So where people sign up to be seen, but then they end up not doing so well compared to the others, and so there's a significant experience of shame.
Yeah, I think there's a great deal of diversity out there in terms of this demand for public recognition, and I think we need to be aware of those type of things because not everyone wants it, and indeed it can backfire in some ways.
Absolutely. There was some early work also from other colleagues that some people actually shy away from the wallpapers, like they shy away and tend to contribute less to charity, not to stand out. So it's really interesting that there's all this heterogeneity. So it seems to my view, sort of like sort of one way to interpret these results is that people feel that they have to give. There's some sort of moral kind of obligation. There's a sense that people do see giving as a moral obligation. So Christina, I would like to talk a little bit about sort of kind of the dark side of moral obligation. Like one manifestation of this desire to maintain a positive image is actually people's tendency to make up excuses to avoid giving. And you've done a lot of work on trying to understand under which conditions and why donors sometimes make up excuses. And you've done work on risk, so the risk of giving as an excuse not to give, or some, for instance, charity performance metrics as a formal excuse to say, oh, this charity doesn't look very good, so this is why I'm not giving. So can you tell us a little bit about this sort of line of research of yours, and what we have learned, and what are, again, some implications that would be useful for practitioners?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a great question. I like how you phrase it with thinking about the dark side here as well. So I'll start with perhaps just a couple of examples. I think one of the things that we've learned is really how individuals form excuses, and then I'll go ahead and conclude with potentially a couple takeaways for practitioners. So in one of my papers that looks at how people use risk as an excuse not to give, I have individuals make a series of binary choices between money for themselves and money for charity. And I have them make these choices in a few different environments. So one of the environments in which they make this choice, excuses are not relevant. The reason excuses are not relevant is because they can't give. So they're perhaps choosing between a certain amount for themselves, say $5, and a lottery for themselves, say a payment that depends on the outcome of a coin flip. Or perhaps excuses aren't relevant because they're forced to give. They're choosing between two options to donate to charity. Again, it could be a certain amount going to charity, maybe it's $10 going to charity, or perhaps more of a risky investment that gets paid to a charity. And these environments where excuses not to give are not relevant because either you're forced to give or you can't give in the first place, we see that individuals respond to risk very similarly. So there's nothing special about if the risk is borne by myself or borne by the charity. But we observe really different patterns of behavior when individuals are instead deciding between money for themselves and money for the charity. In particular, when I'm deciding between money for myself and money for the charity, these seems to be the situations where people start to use risk as an excuse not to give. So what do I mean by that? Well, imagine someone's deciding between a certain amount for themselves and a risky lottery that could benefit the charity. Well, in these situations, Individuals act as if risk is really bad. They act really risk averse as a great excuse to favor the certain amount of themselves and not take that risk that might benefit the charity. Meanwhile, if we do exactly the opposite, the charity potentially could receive a certain amount, or you could choose some risky endeavor that could benefit yourself. These are the situations where all of a sudden now, instead of being risk averse, individuals ask really risk tolerant as apparently more of an excuse to hold on to money for themselves over money for the charity. In the other paper you mentioned that's looking at performance metrics as an excuse not to give, get similar results, but instead of it involving risk per se, it involves charity performance metrics, but essentially what you see is that individuals often act as if lower performance metrics are exceedingly bad when that serves as a great excuse not to give because the outside option is keeping money for themselves. In terms of some implications for practitioners, I think there's a few potential points here. So one is just to be aware of this, to be aware of the potential impact of the information you can provide. Even if you think a performance metric seems really good, perhaps it's a 90% success rate in terms of some program that you just performed, anything less than perfect may be used as an excuse. Indeed, I often see individuals forming excuses around risk levels or success rates that are 95% or 90%. A second takeaway is to try to mitigate excuses by targeting your donors carefully. So one thing that I see in a lot of my work across papers, including a paper with Ragan as well, is that when you focus on individuals who are smaller donors or newer donors or less committed donors, these often seem to be the people who are prone to excuses. And you might want to be particularly reluctant or particularly careful about the type of information you provide them with, because they might use that information as an excuse not to support your cause. But of course, your committed donors, these are going to be the people that are pretty unlikely to use excuses not to give. They're in there to support you. They might actually really want to get into some of these nitty-gritty details around various performance metrics. The third takeaway, which is related, is to really focus on the overall impact when you're providing information to individuals to try to encourage them to give. So as just one example, in one paper, I ask individuals if they're willing to give when their donation is going to be multiplied by 5 or 4.5 or 4 or 3.5 or 3. These are all really high multipliers, and it turns out people are equally likely to give across these multipliers. Those all seem like a really good situation. But if I frame this a little bit differently, if I instead said, if you give, I'm going to multiply your donation rate by 5, but then I'm going to take off a quote unquote processing fee that say is equivalent to 0, 10, 20, 30, 40%. Now individuals are substantially less likely to give as that processing fee increases, even though that's actually equivalent to this first condition that I said. So focusing on the overall impact, I'm just going to multiply your donation by 5 or 3, or here's the overall impact of your donation, might be a successful way to prevent people from narrowly focusing on things that might seem less than perfect, such as a processing fee. And then the final thing I'll say here to mitigate excuses is really to keep it simple. So I have this paper with Judd Kessler at Motivated Heirs, and what we called Motivated Heirs, what we find is that people act confused in exceedingly simple environments as an excuse not to give in response to information on a donation. So you really want to keep it simple so they can't just use that even apparent complexity as a reason to say, I don't understand what's going on, so I'm just not going to donate.
Fascinating. And it must be difficult I assume, for charities to factor in the feedback. Ragan, and you mentioned this question of heterogeneity. They're very different donors. Some are just discouraged donor that wouldn't give anyway. It must be difficult for charities to draw the correct inference about what works and what doesn't, because just observing how people respond, maybe some campaigns may look on paper really bad, but perhaps they're targeting the wrong the wrong donors, and so what is actually would be good targeted on other individuals looks like a bad campaign. That's really fascinating. So we have a question from Jana Gallus, who I think it was referred to the previous question. She's asking a very interesting question, whether there's evidence that the default matter, where what I think Jana means in default is like where the default is whether people have the option to be observed or whether this option is there by default. And if I read correctly, her question, she's hinting at the fact that if visibility is opt-in, it might in some way backfire because it may look like bragging, as in where if visibility is the default, then there's no negative inference that people can draw from you being seen because you didn't choose it. Kind of reminds me of this very nice episode from Curb Your Enthusiasm, where Larry David puts his name, and then there's someone else who his friend that puts the anonymous wing, and but he tells everybody that that it's him. So do you guys know of any evidence on this whether the default matters?
Yes, this is a really great question. So the early work that I did with Jim, you got to sort, like there were two options, there wasn't any default. It seems like the default in general with charities is to report, and you have to request to remain anonymous. So I haven't seen anything where you remain anonymous and you have to request to report. I don't know, Christine, have you seen anything?
I haven't seen anything, but my intuition aligns with yours here in the sense of that's probably be a good way to make observability not effective. As if people have to publicly say, I want to be recognized, that then you're going to have this concern about not wanting to appear as if someone who just cares about perhaps the self-promotion aspect that comes with that. So setting the default of recognition and allowing people opt out seems like would be better, but that's just my intuition, and it seems like good to look at further.
Yeah, I'd be very curious if there are any practitioners out there with some experience on how do you in practice deal with for instance large donors, and that you want to advertise. What is the the strategy you employ where perhaps you want to receive recognition, but you don't want to be the one asking for it. You want to make make it look like you almost didn't want it. It's super interesting. One one question for for the both of you. So you've done work together. You guys mentioned that. How do you in general people can find ways to avoid the ask. There's flexibility in avoiding giving, so using uncertainty, for instance, the kind of things we talked about. What happens if people expect the ask that the ask cannot be avoided? You guys have a recent field experiment where there's no way to get out of it, and I was curious to know a little bit about that.
Okay, so I'll start, and Christine can jump in and add as we go along. So this is a really fun project that we worked on together. It was a field experiment where we wanted to create a situation where people were going to be asked to give, but they didn't know that the ask was coming. So we embedded it in this online voting contest for the best dog rescue place in the Bay Area. And so this way we could test, actually, because people who came to vote in the contest were not expecting any ask to come. And so we could actually either prompt them that an ask was coming or not prompt them that an ask was coming. And it turns out that knowing that the ask is coming decreases the probability that people end up making a donation. So this is this idea, and it's consistent with the work that Christine has done, that just giving that a little bit of time by knowing that this is coming, people can come up with some sort of excuse to actually not follow through and make a donation. We do have some other parts of the study where we give some information about why one might want to make a donation. So information about the animal rescue place and actually a dog that needs help. And that helps to eliminate some of this. But there's still just that little bit of time that you give people actually gives people opportunities to avoid or to actually be less likely to donate.
Super interesting.
I think it was a great summary. It's one that I often talk with students and practitioners about as well, just because I think the cleverness and bragging about ourselves, Ragan, of this voting contest was such a great way to potentially recruit folks to be engaged without expecting an ask. because when a nonprofit sends individuals an email or sends them a postcard or a letter in the mail, I think most people think with probability close to 1 that a donation ask is coming. So finding other ways to engage with your supporters, perhaps even just through these types of voting contests, can be a really, really nice way to attract some support as well.
Wonderful. And we had a comment from Wes Lindell mentioning that the chat is disabled. Wes, if you can, if it's possible to you to just type in the Q&A, we know that we can turn back on, and if it's too time consuming, we'll be happy to just unmute you and you can chime in. We have this sort of yeah. So as we wait for Wes to give us feedback on that, I wanted to sort of switch gears and ask Ragan a few questions about peer-to-peer fundraising. So we know that, you know, charities, of course, do fundraising, but fundraising also happens among peers. So charities often encourage their existing donors to sort of expand the pool of donors by asking their friends, their people they know. And you have run really cool field experiments on that, trying to understand sort of what is the economics behind this peer-to-peer fundraising. And so what would be, what did you find? And what was your, what's some of the recommendations?
Sure, yeah, so peer-to-peer fundraising is really kind of an interesting thing that some charities do. This is, of course, when a donor actually asks their friend to donate to a cause that they care about. And so a lot of the peer-to-peer fundraising that seems to happen is around sporting events, but it doesn't have to be that way. So the sort of general principle of donors asking friends can happen in other situations as well. It doesn't have to be around a sporting event, but nonetheless, it's very popular in the US. I was looking up the statistics on this, and Blackbaud's data shows that about 10 million people have participated in these type of fundraising events over this 3-year period and raised like $1.3 billion. So I suspect for some charities, these are very successful. I suspect it's also kind of something that larger charities really would benefit from, because there can be sort of economies of scale to that. But the interesting thing about peer-to-peer fundraising is that donors are kind of uniquely positioned to request donations from their friends. They have better information than charities. They know who amongst their friends might be more likely to donate, and they may be more effective. So a lot of the surveys that ask people why they've given, one of the main reasons that they give is that they were asked, and they were asked by someone they care about, so a friend or a family member. So it's kind of, so there are a couple interesting aspects of this last point about being willing to give because they were asked, is that, so one way of looking at it is that people being asked, it sort of reduces the search cost for the friend, because the friend now may be unsure where to give, and now the friend is asked, and they can identify, they've now identified a charity that might be of interest for them. It also increases the credibility of the charity, because a friend has just said, this is something I've donated to, I really care about it, maybe you want to donate as well. It also gives social pressure, because the donor is asking their friend to help out a cause, right? So the friend may feel some sort of obligation to actually give to this this charity. So some pressure can be good, but it can backfire too if it's actually too much. And then there's this issue that we've been talking about before about boasting and this sort of recognition. So do I want the recognition? Do I look like I'm boasting by saying I've given? So in fact, in the field experiment that we ended up doing around this idea of asking donors to ask their friends, indeed, only 20% of the people ended up asking friends. So there might be some reticence to people actually following through on it. And one, because maybe it appears like they're boasting, but also it might be costly to ask a friend, because as soon as you ask a friend, you're basically asking them a favor, right, to help you out by helping support your charity. But we also know that this social pressure, these social norms can be very strong at changing behavior. So what we did in this field experiment is it was designed to study whether or not people were actually willing to ask their friends, to actually put this social pressure on their friends and ask them to donate to a charity. So we partnered with an online crowdfunding organization. And after a donor had completed the donation at checkout, they were asked to share the fact that they had donated with a friend and ask them to donate as well. And we did this via Facebook. So we exploited the ways in which people communicate with each other on Facebook, either through posting on their wall, posting on a friend's wall, or sending direct messages. So you can kind of think of it as different ways in which people can ask their friends. So posting on your wall might be asking many people at once. Posting on a friend's wall is asking a friend in front of their friends, or a direct message might be, is this private thing that you could do to actually ask a friend to donate. And so what did we find? So as I said before, we find that actually very few people are willing to ask. So only about 20% are willing to follow through and actually ask a friend. Now, we note that the ask was accompanied with a declaration that the person had made a donation. And we did this because we wanted to give credibility to the ask, meaning that I've actually made a donation to this organization I really care about. Would you do this as well? So not everyone is willing to ask. And people seem to understand that supplying some kind of social pressure can actually be costly. So the way in which, so if we ask people to ask their friend in front of their friends, people were least likely to do that. So it seems that people understand that that might be a very socially costly thing to do, is to ask your friend in front of other people. But if you actually give people a gift that they can give their friend, so we had add-on donations. So we said, if you asked your friend, we would put an add-on donation to your donation. People were more likely to do that. So if they could offer to their friend that an add-on donation would be done in the friend's name, people were more likely to ask their friend. It was also the case if add-on donations were added to the donor's donation, people were more likely to ask. So it appears that if somehow charities can kind of subsidize this ask, then donors are more willing to do so. So what are the takeaways for charities for this? So charities can tap into their donors to ask their friends. They have more information, and they may be much more efficient at actually being able to get people to donate. But because it is costly for people to ask their friends, because they're essentially asking for a favor, then it's important to provide the donors with some way to make the ask more palatable. So it could be with things like small add-on donations that they can make in their friend's name that they can offer as kind of a gift. So as they're asking their friend to give to this charity that they care about, they can say, oh, and by the way, there's actually, I've made an add-on donation for you already. And that could help sort of soften the ask a bit. And we actually find, I mean, our data is a little sparse on the friend side in making the donations, but we do find that this ask of asking the friend in front of their friends seems to be the most effective. So it's used the least, but it seems to be very effective.
That's super interesting. Do you have, I was curious, do you have any data to see if are there different type of donors, the 20% that sort of go through, or is there any observable characteristics that perhaps can have some correlation with the type of behavior?
Yeah, so we didn't see any. So this was, so these aren't big donors. So these are people who were donating through this online crowdfunding community. And so donations were, I think, about on average about $50. And we didn't see anything different in terms of this, like, were larger donors more willing to do this than other types of donors. So we've limited information because we were doing this via Facebook, and we didn't have a lot of, we were not able to extract a lot of their data for privacy reasons, understandably. So we didn't find anything in terms of observable characteristics to be able to explain which donors were more or less likely to be willing to ask their friends.
Very interesting. And was it more effective gifts, for others or for oneself, like as an incentive?
Yeah, so people like getting their own recognition. So if it was the case that there was a gift that was made in their friend's name, but they couldn't tell their friend about it, they were less likely to be willing to ask than if the gift was in their name. So, but if it was the case that the gift was actually in their friend's name and they could actually tell their friend about it, they were much more likely to ask. So, so we read this as being, you know, if you have something that helps sort of make that ask not so more palatable, then people are more likely to actually follow through on the ask.
Super interesting. And so we have a question now back to the question of anonymity. So Wes was mentioning that the default condition of anonymity is very typical in churches. And it was asking if there's any research done in those settings. And I can imagine why anonymity plays an important role in religious contexts, especially our cases where the moral aspect is often considered predominant. Do you guys know of any research that has been done in the context of religious institutions, for instance, in relation to this anonymity and public behavior?
So Ragan, perhaps you remember this paper, but I have a vague recollection. So hopefully based off of a paper that I'm recalling correctly, that was looking at donations in a charity, and basically it looked at an open basket versus closed basket. And the basic finding is the open basket, so when it's less anonymous, yielded much higher donations than when it was a closed basket. But that's what strikes.
Yeah, that's Adrian Sudovan's paper.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah. And this was clearly about public recognition. So he did a nice field experiment where he varied whether the basket was open or closed. And when it was open, people were more likely, or they raised more money. But the question is interesting. So there are, I don't know much about this, the anonymity part of it. So Jim has some stuff about doing this reporting people's donations in churches. And I'm trying to remember the result here, but I think it's something along the lines of, you know, when people actually know their donations being reported, it has a significant impact. But the comment that Wes is making is about what churches naturally do, and I suspect the underlying foundation of giving in churches is really not about boasting, but your contributions in you know, to the church, and they're kept anonymous. But yeah, that's a really interesting question.
It's interesting, yeah, because there's a dimension in which the recipient, in some way, that the church itself, you know, is a target of your desire for being appreciated, right? Often we think that we want to be appreciated by others, but sometimes we want to be appreciated by the target of our donation. And perhaps this is a more salient in cases where the recipient is your own church, where you go every Sunday, and you know, with a pastor or a priest that you see all the time. There's an anonymous attendee that asked, what is an open basket donation? I think it meant whether you see how much money has been put in the basket before or not, essentially. So I think as a basket is passed around, and whether you can see or not how much other attendees are putting there.
And also people can see how much you put into the basket.
You put in, of course, yeah. So back to the sort of peer-to-peer, you mentioned a couple of times, Ragan, that you know, there is this dimension where it is difficult to ask a friend to make a donation because you recognize that it's costly for the other person. There's a dimension which is costly also for you, and you mentioned this idea of trade in favor. Like, you know, if I ask you today to give to my favorite charity, perhaps, you know, tomorrow you're going to ask me to do the same. And you've done research in this area. I was curious about, you know, you studied favor trading and public good provision, and I was curious as sort of what is sort of the main result that you find there, and what are sort of some implication we can extrapolate in some way in the charitable giving context.
Yeah, so So this was a work that I'd done several years ago with Sarah Jacobson, and this was so again around favor trading. So we know people trade favors. So we do something nice for someone, and they do something in return. And this was actually motivated by this idea of Girl Scout cookies, and the idea was that, you know, so my daughter sells Girl Scout cookies, and you'll buy her Girl Scout cookies, and then in the future you can come back and you might ask me to support your child's fundraiser, right? So this idea of favor trading, I do something nice for you, you do something nice for me later on. So what we wanted to do in this project is document favor trading in small groups and understand its effects on actually providing public goods. And sort of the neat result out of this is that, you know, just by allowing people to favor trade, to observe others' behaviors and benefit at various moments. So effectively, someone is the person with the daughter who's selling the Girl Scout cookies, benefits from it. And then in the future, does that person who's benefited from it actually help the other person who's in the position of having the child who's trying to raise money for their fundraiser? And it turns out when you have this kind of system in place, that it actually accelerates or increases people's willingness to contribute to a public good. So just these sort of this social context in which we live and having this ability to do this has this very positive effect on this provision of public goods. And we also did this other treatment as well, where we had someone who was what we called a bachelor, who did not benefit, who had no children, right? So who would not benefit from any of this kind of favor trading. And it turns out that these bachelors didn't engage in contributions to the public goods because there was really no return from it. So those are kind of important to understand in how people are interacting with each other, or their willingness to contribute to public goods. So I think sort of for fundraisers and for charities in general, it's there may not be a favor trading going back and forth necessarily between the donor and the charity, but as charities emphasize the impact of the gift, it's a little bit of a favor trading, because donors often are inspired to give because they really want to make a difference. And if the charity can give something back to them in terms of emphasizing, you know, the impact of what they've done, they've kind of returned a favor in some sense. And we could, I mean, this is charities and donors, but we could also think of any kind of favor trading or provision of a public good within small groups, as long as there is this idea of helping each other out and having a horizon that we'll be helping each other out in the future can have really positive impacts on provision of public goods.
That's interesting. Do you think that the main sort of mechanism is almost like social insurance? Like I know that you know, if I do something nice for you, I'll be covered in the future, kind of like more like this indirect reciprocity idea, or is it more like revealing preferences, like by sort of agree to trade favor, we almost like reveal each other that we are in to be cooperative and in to be nice and sort of participate in the public good?
Well, yeah, so our research sort of suggests that it's a little bit of the former, because if you take that away, you still contribute to a public good, but there's no opportunity for this benefit of benefiting from a favor.
Come back to you.
It was much lower. So I mean, it sounds very instrumental to to say that people may be just out there for this kind of favor trading or direct reciprocity, but I think it's kind of natural to think that we may be you know, doing these kind of things as we go through life. And is it a social insurance? Well, I mean, there are lots of examples of you know, throughout history of, and especially in let's say a lot of developing countries where people purposefully marry across areas, geographical areas, as kind of I don't know if it's a social insurance, but it's an insurance, an income insurance, right? It's a way of smoothing income in case there are bad shocks in one area, there might be good shocks in other areas. So this sort of way of kind of spreading that out is yeah, I think not unheard of.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So I want to slightly switch gears. So far we've been talking a lot about one type of incentive, which is social image recognition, social pressure, and all the ways in which these type of non-monetary incentives sort of affect donors giving. But there are often some more direct ways and more more tangible ways to encourage giving. And for instance, we can think in the context of volunteering, you can imagine providing direct benefits to volunteers. And there's always a little bit of reluctance in thinking about connecting private benefits with some inherently pro-social behavior, because this idea that these personal incentives could crowd out the desire to do good if people are afraid that they might be perceived as selfish, right? So, and all of a sudden I'm being paid for volunteering, and I might be afraid that that might signal that I'm actually volunteering for the benefit and not because I like to volunteer. So I have one question for Christina, who has done some work that has shown that one important mediator in this crowding out is past reputation. So what have you done in the past? So why past history matters so much for social image, and in what way?
Yeah, so I think this is a great question, and it's a nice transition between these topics. So I think they're related. So exactly as you flag, if I imagine that I'm someone who was incentivized to donate at a blood bank, perhaps you're going to give me a gift card if I donate blood. And imagine you don't know anything about me, but you see me donating at this blood bank, and you know that I was receiving this gift card because I donated there. Well, now I might be demotivated to actually go donate because I'm thinking, well, you're going to think I just want the gift card. You're not going to think that I'm actually in it because I want to help others. So that could deter me from donating in the first place. Now imagine a different state of the world where you know me very well. I'm actually someone who donates regularly at the blood bank. Perhaps I do this once every month. Now, if the same blood bank comes around and offers a gift card to donate, and I know that you're going to see me donating and getting this gift card, well, I'm not really going to be concerned about you thinking that I'm doing it just for the gift card, because you know I would have donated anyways. So when we're thinking about some of these perhaps perverse effects of incentives, particularly when they relate to image, if someone's reputation is already established, so they don't have to worry about appearing greedy because people already know that they were established volunteer in the first place, so clearly they're not in it for the gift card or the t-shirt or so on and so forth, then these backlash effects might be less severe. And essentially this is what I find in an online and lab experiment that seeks to replicate some of those features, that if you establish individuals' reputations, you don't see these backlash to incentives to volunteer.
Wonderful, very, very interesting. And in the meantime, we had a few questions, I think perhaps related, obviously the Q&A doesn't help, but some questions related to, I think perhaps a previous point we touched upon. So one question from an anonymous attendee is whether there's evidence that indicates whether having a public target fundraising goal helps. So making public whether, what is the goal to reach, and for instance, giving an example, raising 5K for a community event. Is there any evidence that publicly advertised targets sort of encourages giving?
Sure. So I'm happy to take the first stab at this question. So there's certainly a lot of work that looks at how targets can be an effective motivator. And I think you see this both in the volunteer and charitable giving space, as well in more classic, perhaps workplace type settings. So I have some work that looks at this in the volunteering space as well. And if you set individuals a target to say volunteer to 10 hours, that really motivates individuals to volunteer to exactly 10 hours. Gets back to some of Ragan's earlier points of when you set these target amounts, people become really focused on those target amounts. So you often really need to be careful in how you set them. Interestingly, I was having a conversation earlier with a colleague about this general idea, and I'm not sure how much academic research there is to support it, but that with large capital campaigns for organizations or nonprofit organizations as well, this idea that you should already be sufficiently far along in your target, right? It should be 50% funded before you tell anyone about it. Certainly the extreme case, you don't want to set a target that you're unlikely to reach. That certainly could be demotivating. But perhaps Ragan has some to add as well.
Yeah, I've had conversations with so I've had some conversations with some charities where the idea of setting the target can be really important. I agree with Christine, it can be terribly demotivating. So targets can be or goals in anything in life, I suppose, can be motivating, but if they're too far out of reach, then they just seem impossible. So I guess they have to be set in a ways that you feel like you could reach it and you've accomplished something. It's not too easy, not too hard. And in terms of fundraising, I've heard the similar kind of thing that people basically do sort of back end or front end fundraising before going into any kind of capital campaign to do this type of thing. I've talked to some charities where they also make sure, so you want to be successful, I guess. So there are ways of sort of thinking about setting targets or goals in ways that will be, you'll be sure to get there precisely because you've done some of this front end thing. Again, you don't want to be in a situation where you don't reach it. Yeah, and
there's this signaling value of that sort of, as you were mentioning, at the level of the target, that it might have this discouraging effect. So this is kind of an ambivalence. On the one hand, a very ambitious target may have a positive effect. It seems like we can achieve more if the pot is bigger, but at the same time, if there's fear that the target is too high, there might be some discouragement.
Yeah, and I really don't know how to think about where that should actually be, because sometimes people find really high targets extremely motivating in businesses as well, that you just have this sort of bold, ambitious goal and you kind of go for it and make it happen. So the literature, I've read a bit about some of the goal setting literature, and it's not, I don't see a clear answer for how you think about where those things should be set, or how to think about setting them.
That'd be an interesting research, and I guess probably also whether the ask is repeated or not. That perhaps also plays a role, whether it's our one-time campaigns or sort of repeated asks. There might be. It just came to mind because you mentioned the literature on goal setting, but also habit formation. This idea that you can't move from never going to the gym to go every day. You need some small rewards, and perhaps if a campaign is repeated sufficiently enough, like smaller targets may have a motivating effect on donors. So there were a couple of anonymous comments. I assume from the same person there was a little positive that about the fact that we sort of seem to refer about charitable giving as something completely voided by the impulse of altruism. So I just want to point out, of course, we as economists, we don't think that altruism doesn't matter, of course. We thought that this specific sort of episode was interesting, an interesting moment to discuss one of the many reasons why people give. In this specific case, some form of impure altruism related to social image and other factors. But by no means, none of us here on this panel, I think, believe that that this is the only reason why people give, and that's certainly not the way economists think about this problem. It's just that there's a lot of work on many different reasons, sort of why people give, and sort of we're kind of focusing here today due to time constraints about one very specific motive and set of motives. But of course, there are many other reasons, and by no means we imply that giving is all about showing off. Not at all. It's just more about understanding what are the economics behind that image motivation. So there were a couple of comments from Becky Schaffer. She's mentioned that we always refer to it as a stretch goal. I think go back to the where you should have set the target. And she says also we find that if the target is affiliated with a specific cause, for instance, backpacks for kids versus general unrestricted, there is better motivation to give. It's very interesting.
Yeah, so I agree. So that's sort of the specific compared to the general idea. Indeed, this seems to happen sometimes with a little bit of crowding out, sometimes with when there are disasters. Mm-hmm. So, for example, people are very motivated by a disaster and they want to give for the disaster, but maybe the organization has said, okay, we've had enough, right? We have enough for the disaster. Could you help out with a general fund? And people are not very interested in this because they really are motivated. They really want to help with this thing. And so I think that's a very motivating thing to know that you have this sort of picture in your head of how you can help out, and having this picture of a particular thing is very motivating. And general thing is not very inspiring, perhaps. So I guess the interesting thing also is kind of how to think about, if especially like for the disaster story, if you sort of reached your goal for the disaster and there's still this interest, how can you sort of shift that still towards helping your organization, even when that specific thing has been met, and that's something I think is still an open question. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I sort of we have a little bit less than 10 minutes, and I have still two questions, one for each of you, and then I hope that questions will keep coming through. So one question for you, Christine, is in sort of many reasons why, so many tools that fundraisers use to fundraise, one is becoming particularly sort of used and important is pledges, like asking people not to give today, but to make a commitment to give. So you have done work not in charitable giving, but you have studied the role of commitment in taking commitment devices, like decisions that you make today that force your future self to follow through. And you have a very intriguing hypothesis for why people choose today to restrict their future choices. And your hypothesis is that it's signaling to others, like you're taking up a commitment device, it's signaling something to others. So can you give us a sense of like what the research was, and maybe if there's some connection with the emerging literature on pledges? It looks like perhaps there was a so it seems like there was a connection problem, perhaps. So maybe when we give a few moments to Christine to come back, maybe Ragan, I can pass the ball to you. So we're going to put on hold the question about pledges, and I wanted to ask you a question about children. So we, of course, generally are adults that give, and we think about giving as an act that is made by adults, but children are the givers of the future. And you've done really a lot of super interesting work on exploring the preferences of children, what drives children's behavior. Can you tell us a little bit about that research, even if it's not directly related to charitable giving? I think practitioners would be really appreciative of learning a little bit.
Yeah, so a lot of the stuff that I've been working on is trying to understand decision making of kids, and most of this is around understanding how patience or their willingness to take risks affect other kind of outcomes. But there has been work by other people around pro-social preferences of children, and sort of the kind of the larger takeaway from some of these is that is that there's a great deal of diversity in terms of people's willingness to be pro-social. And this actually manifested this is documented in adults, and it's also documented in children. It manifested at a very young age. And I suppose anybody who works in fundraising, understands that there's this huge diversity, people who will always give, people who will never give, and then the marginal giver that you might be able to persuade. And this seems to show up again at young ages. And what's sort of interesting about this is that, there's a growing interest in trying to understand how people's preferences for equality or efficiency might, it affects our policies, it affects what is offered in society. There's a large conversation now about, offering universal childcare or universal preschool, and these are things that other countries offer. So understanding the preferences that people have in the population, and then also where these come from are extremely interesting. There's still a lot of work to be done to really understand these things, but there's certainly some research that suggests that there are early interventions early in childhood that can affect the preferences, especially the social preferences of children. So John List and Anya Samek have some really nice work that they did in Chicago with their preschool that shows that this early childhood preschool has an effect on young children's willingness to share with other children. So these are all lab type experiments. There's also some work from Europe that's also showing that children's pro-social preferences, so people learn to be more willing to share as they get older. So I guess kind of I think the takeaway from this is that, again, there's this great deal of diversity out there in the population, and it certainly comes and emerges really at this young age. And so there may be some sort of need to sort of think about cultivating this idea of sharing and pro-sociality at a young age. And that's certainly something that I've seen other researchers thinking about, like what are the things that might affect people's willingness to have more equitable preferences in terms of thinking about how society decides to share and such. And what's sort of interesting is that, parents, of course, try to model behavior for their children, but at least from the experimental side, there hasn't been tons of evidence that suggests that whether this transmission of preferences from parents to child is very strong, even though everyone's trying to do those things. I think there's a lot of work that still needs to be done to understand how that happens. And its effect on children, and children become adults, and
yeah, of course. That's really fascinating. So I think our times is up. We have sadly lost due to technical difficulties one of our speakers. So these things happen sometimes on Zoom. Hopefully, next year we're going to be in presence, so hopefully that won't happen. That won't happen again. But Ragan, I really wanted to thank you for joining us, sharing your expertise and your insights from your research. I think I really appreciate it, and I'm sure all our SPI members really appreciate it as well. And of course, thanks a lot to Christina, who dropped out, yeah. So thanks everyone, of course, the attendees for all the questions and the comments. We really appreciate, and we're looking forward to see you all next month for our 4th installment of the SPI seminar series.